You're failing at school? It must be video games. You're having a bad day? It must be video games. Your ice cream dropped to the floor?
Damn those meddling video games.
We always hear the traditional media talking about video games as dangerous or violence-inducing and bad influence. I don't know if you noticed, but they usually just love to pull up GTA 5 whenever they talk about violent games as an example. And because of this idea, this video games cause violence narrative has been very widespread to more than mass media, to also in social settings. So your parents will come in the room seeing that you're playing video games or immediately stop you. No, you shouldn't play video games, you should do something else. Especially at that period when the World Health Organization announces that it's going to be a gaming disorder. So basically they defined a disorder specifically associated with gaming, and that's caused a lot of backlash. Many YouTubers and gamers rebutted against this notion, saying that it's unfair for the media to specifically target video games when video game is only one category of all different forms of media. So what about movies, and what about advertisement? Why is video games so specifically targeted? And those are good arguments, don't get me wrong. My own bias is a bit towards video games. So like any other videos on this platform, it's better that you take my opinion with a grain of salt. But we can't just look at only the bad and only the good side of the subject. That's why the title of this video is not that are video games good, it's how are video games good? To do that, we need to look at some empirical evidence, and to look at empirical evidence, we need to look at past researchers and how researchers think about video games. With scientific evidence, what exactly is the influence of video games? First, we need to look at where does the idea of video games cause violence come from? Where does it all stem? Well, in 1963, there is this social learning theory raised by Bandura, and with the theory, they conducted a famous bubble doll experiment. In the experiment, they divided two groups of children. Each child will be placed in a room with an inflatable doll. So in one group of children, they will be inside the room with an adult modeler or an experimenter, and the adult modeler would punch the doll in front of the child. And another group of children, they were placed in a room with an adult modeler who was non-violent towards the bubble doll, so they won't be punching it, they were just doing other neutral stuff. And also there was a control group in which the child would have no adult modeler inside the room, they'd be just by themselves and as control samples. But anyway, as the adult modeler demonstrated their violence or non-violence towards the doll, they left the room and only the child was in the room. And this is the foundation of the video game bad perspective. Those children who watched the adult punch the doll was, as you have guessed, punch the doll as well. They just follow the adult modeler's example and do the same. And for those who did not watch the adult punch the doll, they did not punch the doll. So yeah, this is the foundation. People watch, people learn. So what the mass media would infer is that gamers would watch violent content of video games, and then because they watch more violence, they are more likely to replicate violent behaviors in real life. But is it that simple? First, we need to look at some criticism against this theory. First off is the bubble doll experiment focused on super young children. They actually conducted a few experiments. The first experiment, the mean age of the children samples are 2.3 years old. 2.3 years old. They can't even play Tetris at that age. So how do you associate the learning process of a very young child to gamers? I don't know, the youngest gamers can be, I don't know, teenagers or at least 6 years old, or adult gamers. The second criticism is context matters. You need to look at the background of the situation. The children in the experiments are facing against a doll. I guess even the child is 2 years old, they would recognize that the doll is not a real human being. So there are criticisms saying that the children are not actually exacting violence against the doll, they're just play fighting. It's like children playing tumble onto the ground in a playground in the park. Play fighting is not the same as violence. And the third criticism is, how long are such aggression effects? There are experiments in 2007 and 2010 that test how long these modeling aggression effects last. Well, the result is that it is small to non-significant. So the child may follow the punching behavior for a while, but then they will just forget about it. Or maybe they have other models in real life. So the experiment has demonstrated that this aggression induced by seeing an example do not permanently burn into our mind. So with that said, the notion of watching video games or playing video games more is going to make you more violent in terms of social learning theory is false, or I guess in a scientific term, non-significant. So apparently the video games cause violence notion is not entirely backed by science. It still doesn't mean that video game is perfectly good, so we're still not off the hook yet. Second, we need to see, is video game bad for mental health? There are studies that show significantly bad effects from gaming to mental health, and usually they touch on excessive gaming, which means that when gamers play so much game that they abandon their real-life social network, not only do their social functioning suffers, they also increase in problematic behaviors and anxiety as well. So this also aligned with the definition of gaming disorder from the World Health Organization, which says that the obsessive and compulsive overuse of internet games and video games as an escape from life and causes negative consequences. Streamers, YouTubers, you guys play a lot of games though. You play games for a living, right? Some of you even have subathons gaming. Do you guys have gaming disorders? Are you guys committing excessive gaming? Relax, it depends. In a 2017 study by Carras et al., this negative impact is more related to motivation. To be specific, it is related to the individual choice to play games for the sake of escaping real-life problems. So if you play games to escape your own, real-life issues, then your motivation will impact the effects of gaming to your mental health. It is kind of like any type of addiction. Alcohol addiction, shopping addiction, workout addiction. The problem is not video game itself. The problem is not the subject of addiction. The subject of addiction doesn't cause the problem for you in the first place. Even if video games suddenly poof out of existence, if you are a person who has a tendency to run away from your problems, you're just going to find something else to get addicted to. In fact, if you're a person who takes care of your mental health and you like games, video game is going to boost your social functioning. Remember, in many games there are messages, voice chats, emotes, multiplayer game modes, all sorts of things for us to socialize while gaming. These elements are beneficial to our social well-being. This is backed by a study in 2012, by the way. And at this point, let's take a breather here, while I have to say something quite important about all these data and research. First off, science is not simply just fact. It is a process of induction and deduction. What is discovered today may be debunked tomorrow. Science is technically more objective than any armchair theories because researchers use empirical evidence for support, and they use very systematic measurements to get their data so that it is easy to compare different scientific results. But we are all humans trying to navigate this universe. Maybe this method is not advanced enough, maybe there's an error in the experiment, maybe the algorithm is wrong, maybe there's political or financial motives for researchers to publish a biased result, and we call it science to this day. I don't know. We don't know. I mean, that's how the anti-vaxxers come to be. Science can be updated and changing as time goes. But what's good about it is that all scientific research is written down thoroughly, and we can scrutinize every bit of detail in their methodology and data. If they're bogus, we can just call them out. Even years later, we can just still pick out the research paper, see their methodology and limitation and results in even their analysis method, and see whether they're bogus. With that said, why am I telling you this? Is that the effect of violence in video games do have mixed results in science. Now we're talking about the relationship between violence in video games and specifically mental health symptoms. So study on this topic are quite limited. It's because everyone is so excited about violent behavior instead of mental health. So in comparison, not a lot of researchers looked at mental health itself, like depression and anxiety symptoms. And even the existing ones about depression and anxiety symptoms are mixed. Some studies says that the violence in video games can decrease hostile feelings and depression, probably because gamers can vent out their negative feelings during the day. And some study says that video games have nothing to do with mental health symptoms at all, or the effect is non-significant. But of course, few to none of these research are very publicized because it is not as sensational a topic as video games cause violence, and so they're not as widely spread. In this case, we should find a balance between these studies, and for now, assume that violence in video games has just maybe a little bit, maybe good, maybe bad influence on your mental health, but it is not a lot. Now for the good news. How can video games be good for you? The most influential factor of how video games affect you, we've talked about it, is motivation. And how do we take advantage of that? First off, according to a study in 2012, cooperative games encourage higher level of positive interaction than competitive games, which result in higher levels of enjoyment and lower levels of aggression. So cooperative games, kind of like those multiplayer MMORPG, you have teammates, you have guild. Overwatch, you are cooperating with your gamers. But if you see it as a competitive game, if you just want to compete against people, you just want to win, the good effects will be lowered. So according to this study, the good effects of increasing levels of enjoyment and lowered levels of aggression is only significant if the motivation is socially driven rather than achievement, obsession, or escaping from other problems. So let's use another study. Among Us. There are two people who both play Among Us. They're in the same group, playing the same game, with all the same settings. But one person, they play the game specifically because they just enjoy spending time with friends. They enjoy talking with people and they enjoy the process. But the other person who play Among Us, he's playing it to win. He's not here to make friends, he's here to win. And he's obsessed with killing everyone. And when he loses, he gets very angry, he rage quit. So two people doing the same thing, but with different motivation. And they, of course, they are going to experience different effects. So this is the interesting part. There are studies that says that if you play a moderate frequency of video games, maybe a few hours a week, you tend to have better mental health status, sometimes even academic skills, than those who don't play video games at all. But there comes the question, what is considered moderation? And is moderation for me considered moderation for you? There are different people who have different status, who are built different, and so we can only find an average, but we still need more research to back up that point. So, in conclusion, the notion of video games cause violence is not backed by science. Video games violence could be bad for your mental health, but the effects of violence in video games is small to non-significant, and the way that video games can be bad for you is that you're playing video games obsessively and you're playing for the sake of escaping from real life problems. And video games can be good for you if you're playing in moderation and you're playing for the sake of having fun, or you're playing with friends instead of playing to win. Of course, I think there are gaps in my research. As I look through some scientific paper, I'm going to link some of the papers in the description so you can have a look for yourself. There might be something I said wrong, or maybe something you think differently. Feel free to comment below and tell me your opinion. How do you think video games are good for you? Or maybe what video games are good and what video games are bad? Feel free to say anything, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to this channel so that you can get notification in the future. And with that said, thank you for watching. See ya!